Well, having watched two series of the RTD formula of New Who with Ncuti'S, I often wondered if he understood the character of the Doctor. You know, more detached, more asexual, and of course, as many of us say, wasn't he anti-establishment? Until those moments he isn't, of course. But his use of unit in these last two seasons, his over-reliance on it, he seems to land now saying, have you got that ready? Have you got that? It's almost as if it's just his toy. Now, how far away is that removed from the John Pertwee era? Discuss, I suppose. But it feels too familiar now. The yearning for domestic suburban life, the Doctor. How many stories have we had where he just wants to be a husband? He just wants to be a dad. Oh, for God's sake, go and just land in Albert Square again, mate, and just get on with it. So that element of the Doctor. And in some ways, he just seems so establishment now, so conventional, so wanting to just follow the norm. However, I will concede, and you can see it on screen, he was wearing societal pushing outfits, gender pushing outfits, as they called them. His rebellious sexual behaviour, you could say, well, that's anti-establishment. We had iterations of this. We've got what he wore in the finale when he was so proud that while he seemed to be in this retro 1950s world in wedded bliss, he then suddenly thinks, stuff my pinstripe suit, I'm coming down the stairs in a dress. And the music obviously ramped up, and all of a sudden he found himself a coming out moment for the Doctor. That was anti-establishment, surely, Brendan. And of course, the kiss, Rogue, all that stuff. You could argue, is this anti-establishment? Or is this the new establishment, which is, that's the fad, that's the fashion, the LGBTQ list. So basically anybody who wants to join that list is very establishment. I suppose it's all a bit like that. So, good to see you, Hugh. It's a simple little question. Should the Doctor be anti-establishment? Is the Doctor anti-establishment? Am I just getting my knickers in a twist?
So I think the Doctor is always, to an extent, a bit establishment, because there is an aspect to him which follows cultural mores, and sort of like since 1963, sort of he's an anti-hero, but he's also not. It then goes through sort of like various iterations. Obviously, you get John Pertwee working with Unit. Patrick Troughton's work with Unit, I think, is much more ambivalent. But the anti-establishment part of the Doctor is because he's actually, to me, anti-establishment of the Time Lords. I know that's not written in at the start, but he's on the run from his people. So his relationship with us is very different in that he can be establishment to an extent with the human race and sort of like and go along with it. But at the same time, he's also has to think, well, this is the best I've got available, so I will use Unit in order to do certain things if it's strictly necessary. But it's a bit of a burden, and I'm not really that interested in doing that generally. So there is an anti-establishment bit which is there, but it's different in his relationship to humanity, I think, and other races, as opposed to his own race and how that works.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of how it was established at the very beginning, they're on the run. I think he said exiled. He actually used the word exiled. It's a very strong pejorative term. And you think, well, there's the tension. There's the sexiness of it. This character is exiled from his own people and is on the run. And that's what was established early on. That's very anti-establishment. That's very anti-society almost. He's out of the norm. He's a pariah. That's where the drama is, of course. If somebody's an establishment character, if somebody just fits in, where's the drama?
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting if you take sort of the classic example of what's seen as the most establishment Doctor, which is Pertwee when he's friends with Tubby Rowland and the club and all that sort of stuff. Yes, he is very much part of that, but you always get the impression with Pertwee that he's doing that for an ulterior motive in order to deal with the fact that he's stuck on Earth, and which is an interesting idea of restricting the Doctor, which then changes the dynamic from previously. But he's not. He uses it in quite a. So he uses the establishment, I think, rather than is necessarily part of it.
Yes, I was thinking that it's one of those where people, it's like people say, "Oh, Doctor Who was always political, don't you realise?" And you're thinking, "Oh, hold on a minute, it's a little bit more complex than that." Yes, on the surface of it, it looks as though the Third Doctor was very establishment, and you've just quoted one of the lines that we could all say that he sounds as though he goes to gentlemen's clubs and all the rest of it. He sounds as though he's very, very well connected. But there's a means to an end, isn't there? I mean, let's face it, he's using UNIT because he wants to escape it. He's
Mhm.
he's using some of their machinery, and yes, I'll help you with one of these mysteries. I'll help you with one of these things because obviously I'm curious, but oh, it's so tedious because I'm trying to get my dematerialization circuit fixed, and I'm trying to escape really. And there's loads of moments. He's so rebellious, and he's actually working against the brigadier, and he's working against everybody. He's actually just trying to do his own thing. He almost comes across as almost selfish, but anti-establishment. I mean, so the Third Doctor is complex in that it's not as simple as he's cushy and he likes a cup of tea at some gentleman's club.
And I think a lot of the gentleman's club stuff is, if you're watching it, it's actually pretends on Pertwee. He knows how to do his doctor knows how to do this, knows how to sound as if they're part of the establishment, knows that that's a way of getting things done, by sounding as if you're part of the establishment. So therefore he uses that. It's a bit like he's almost a spy in that sense. So sort of like Pertwee's sort of interest in James Bond is part of that. And Bond is a character who, although is part of the establishment, is
Yeah.
played anti-establishment for most of it and goes against the rules and does things that aren't expected. And that's why James Bond is so good, because he is not a follower of rules. And there's an awful lot of that within different parts of Doctor Who, that is about not following rules, but you still might have an establishment view of what is good. So saving the world is a good thing, although quite often the best bits are where the Doctor loses patience with humanity for just being incredibly annoying. But
One of
sorry, on you go.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we have talked about before, because it's one of your passions, is his relationship with the brigadier. Because if he's so establishment, the Doctor, then he's working within a military organization, and you'd think if he was establishment, he'd be following the hierarchy and the pattern and their ethos, but he doesn't. He challenges the military ethos. He challenges their way of thinking. So how is that establishment?
Mm-hmm. And the great thing, obviously, as we've discussed, I mean, Nicholas Courtney is unbelievably good as the Brigadier, but quite a lot of that writing is that over the period of time, the Brigadier becomes a more rebellious character as well. It's seen as incredibly successful for what they do, because they're saving the world every second week, but it's also doing in a way which is quite often against the regulations, or quite often against the direct orders of people, because he's influenced by the Doctor. And that's one of the interesting things, the development of that. I think to an extent that it was other way round, and the Doctor overall becomes slightly more establishment because of the Brigadier's influence, but that's in part because it's almost impossible to dislike Nicholas Courtney and the Brigadier. It's just a brilliant piece of acting.
And the other thing about the Third Doctor, before I expand this, of course, because it just to make this cohesive, really, um, he was establishment in other ways, the Third Doctor. So, for example, if he lands him on Peladon, he tries to follow common courtesy and etiquette. Draconia, he likes to show all he seems to fit in that way and blend in. Then other times, of course, classic Doctor, he challenges the norm. But I always found it funny that he followed the royal etiquette on Draconia and all the rest of it, very, very establishment. Or is it, as you said with the Tubby Rowland thing, he's just using that to actually
Yeah.
just kind of fit in and
So
integrate?
I think in some form that's like psychic paper.
Yeah.
It's a way to get the story going. So if you arrive every time and go, your culture's laughable and it's all a piece of shit, then you're not going to get very far. So some of it is an acting role for the Doctor to say, yeah, I'll go along with this because I need more information. I need to get access to things. I need to be able to talk to people. And if I just wander in and go, this is all ludicrous, it's not going to work. Tom Baker, to an extent, goes against that then and does it simply by force of character rather than
Yeah.
anything else, and does do a lot of the this is all nonsense. You know, horror Fang Rock. He thinks pretty well, and everyone in it is pretty well horrible, but he thinks they're pretty horrible and tells them that,
Yeah.
and doesn't really go along with that. So I think there are different ways of doing it. But I think that that's very much a means of getting the story done rather than necessarily saying anything else.
I can see what you're saying. You scare me slightly because that means people can capture what we've said as a soundbite and suddenly say, isn't that why? Surely you realise that the 15th Doctor saying honey and babes all the time is his version of psychic paper, you
Yeah,
see?
yeah. To an extent, I think if it was done with a return, then that would be true. But it's very. I think that's very much done, and it doesn't give you any return. Whenever he says it, it's not. He's not trying. He's not winning over the right people, and he's not getting access because of that. Maybe that is him being anti-establishment, but I mean, he's seen much more as a celebrity in terms of unit
Mm.
rather than anything else. It was much. I think it was much more interesting whenever they introduced Torchwood, and he was seen as someone that you had to be very careful of,
Yeah.
rather than the best friend anyone could have. And I think that's quite different. I think there should be attention. The whole thing, whenever his relationship with Harriet Jones, um, who should now come on and introduce herself, uh, it is much more complex than this thing that we've ended up with Unit. And Unit itself has become something neither fish nor fowl, which again I think is the problem with a lot of new writing, that it was a special thing whenever it was the brigadier in charge, but it was also to the side, and it wasn't given all of the money and all of the power and stuff like that. It to itself was still a bit spit and paper pulled together by the people there. It wasn't in charge,
Yeah.
and this enormous having an enormous unit building in the centre of London just seems a bit weird.
You're too right. And it takes us so far away from, I mean, the Crotons, classic Doctor Who, you fight an oppressive regime. Basically, in essence, anti establishment, I'm with you lot, the oppressed. That in essence, I mean, RTD, that's how you do it. It's just a simple, you take that side, end of. You don't take that side and go to bed with them. You don't, in other words, all of a sudden you start to doubt the Doctor's motives. I mean, if he's helping one side just because he wants to get his rocks off, that almost isn't moral. It's exploitative. This is straightforward. Yeah, I don't like what the Crotons are doing. I'll side with you, and we'll tamper with it. And he makes. I mean, it's Samson and Delilah. He'll have the pillars collapse. He will really bring down that regime if
Mhm.
you take him out. I mean, that in essence was the Doctor, wasn't it? That
Yeah,
and
and I think that the important point that you're making there is that it sort of depends on what type of establishment you're talking about. So if you've got a society which is liberal with a small L, allows votes, all that type of thing, that reflects what we normally think of as British society, then it's not an establishment that he necessarily wants to bring down. I mean, whenever, I mean, the classic "Doesn't she look tired?" about how it is because she has done something which he sees as morally wrong, and has taken a step which is a step too far in terms of going down the militaristic route. And I think that's an interesting bit where you suddenly go, yeah, I'm supportive of this regime until it becomes totalitarian. And there's the whole aspect of this that goes back to the fact that so much of Doctor Who originally has the influence of what happened in World War II. And sort of like we have the Daleks as Nazis and things like, and those type of allegories. That's what the Doctor's actually fighting against, is fighting against Nazis.
Yeah. And then, of course, the War Games is another example where, if you call it a narrative arc, but no, we won't. RTD would. That basically from 1963 to 1969, you suddenly have the full circle that he was on the run, and then there's the moment when Judgment Day, he has to face the Time Lords and he has to be pulled back. And you then realize, yes, how anti-establishment they've found him, because they judge him, they sentence him, he's punished. And so you realize he is an outsider, and you realize probably why he didn't like the Time Lords or didn't want to stay there. So the War Games helped underline what we hadn't seen, we just understood. And of course, they seemed very, as in those days, Time Lords seemed very boring. I mean, they had that telepathic thing, but they tedious. I think Robert Holmes always said it was always like, they were just bean counters. That was just very kind of, So yeah, anti-establishment. You just want to get out there and live, and see the world. Very bohemian in some ways. You mentioned Tom Baker, of course. I mean, the Sunmakers is a classic one where we'll again, oppressive regime will go against a very strong system there. Deadly Assassin was the other one, of course. When he came across again the Time Lords, and although he cleverly used Time Lord law to actually buy himself time. But yeah, you've got a few stories there as kind of ideas about how anti-establishment he can appear.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the Deadly Assassin is one of those ones which becomes quite. It changes the lore quite a lot in that sense, but it is still about the fact that he finds the Time Lord society boring, and it's about their move to not being, to not intervening. But of course, there are all the stories where they use him to intervene because he's the one that does that type of thing. Again, we're sort of back at the James Bond comparison, the idea that you're fighting, you're using your best tool, which is for the Time Lords, is the Doctor. And I think the tension sometimes there, whenever they are using him to deal with what they see as threats, is a question that has never really been dealt with properly as to whether he's happy with that or whether he just likes to be used in order to get the power sometimes to do the things that he needs to do. Obviously, Genesis of the Daleks is classic.
I mean, and there is complexity. Just sitting on Deadly Assassin for a moment, some of my notes here were, for example, he does, as we said, openly criticise the Time Lord's stagnant society, calls their rituals barbaric in episode 1, infiltrates their political system to expose the plot. His willingness to risk execution by facing the assassin alone defies their judicial system, culminating in a physical rebellion against the master. So there's all that. But there's a counterpoint. This is the thing. He ultimately restores order by ensuring a new president, suggesting the desire to reform rather than destroy establishment.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think there's a strange acceptance there about the fact that I suppose it's not strange. It's the classic example that it's evolution rather than revolution, and it's only whenever there is no other choice that the Doctor goes for the revolution aspect of it. And I think that's whenever you're talking about deeply totalitarian societies within it. Whereas the idea is if you can make it a bit better and it's not such a totalitarian aspect in the first place, then that's allowed. But it's an interesting conflict, I think.
Yeah, and you know, just to kind of expand in so many different ways, I'll show one or two of these that might trigger certain other examples for you. Kinder, you know, I mean, there were elements there where it was very anti-establishment with, I mean, yeah, I'll just park it there. We've obviously done a review of that. Please check it out, everybody. Remembrance of the Daleks. I mean, he again used the military organization to do what he wanted. He had a plan that he was not informing them of. He was almost quite unhelpful because they were trying to work out what the hell they were facing, and yet he knew exactly what was going on until it went a bit out of control. And so not very helpful at all. Not a team player.
No, no. I mean, I think that's a crucial aspect of it, that he's not a team player, despite having a team of his own. He doesn't generally play well with others in terms of the establishment. He can do, but he doesn't. I mean, the interesting thing about Kinder there is that in the end, that similarly to Deadly Assassin, is he doesn't get rid of the society. He just makes sure that the colonial aspects of the Earth society are a bit tempered. And where it had been going really mad and dictatorial, it then becomes much more collegiate and moves away from colonial.
Yeah, and he might question a little bit of the colonial attitude, but he didn't, as you just mentioned a bit earlier, cause a revolution. He just questions a little bit, tweaks it a little bit. And actually, the anti-establishment thing is also set up quite nicely narratively because he's not allowed to meddle. So you get this lovely touch, I think, when they get Doctor Who just right, that of course he meddles, but it's tweaking. It's not full on revolution, which is very much meddling and out of control. And I think the Time Lords would haul you back in straight away until they want Genesis of the Daleks. But yeah, there's that. I mean, and again, I am confused and torn, Hugh, because for every moment he's anti-establishment, I'll say to you, he's a New Who example. It's one of my favorite episodes, Stolen Earth. The Shadow Proclamation. He went. You know, the Shadow Proclamation, clearly with the Jadoon there and everything, are very establishment. And he went there until he ran away from them. But he works with establishment. Is the way he used the Shadow Proclamation almost like he used Tubby Rowlands and used that?
Yeah, and sort of, are the Shadow Proclamation and are the Judoon in that sense just unit in rhinoceros masks? He cannot influence the society just by going in and calling for revolution, because he doesn't. I don't think he necessarily has a belief in how society works, other than he knows societies like totalitarian ones are bad. He likes freedom, and therefore, if you like freedom, it's classic example of the paradox of liberalism. If you like freedom, you have to tolerate certain things that wouldn't be your choice, because that's the deal.
I have to throw in some elements of New Who just to make this fair. And so here's one that really will be a problem. The Day of the Doctor, because you're dealing with different doctors. And the War Doctor's the one who obviously, regarding the moment and regarding being, you know, I will blow the whole thing up. I'm very against what's going on. So the War Doctor's intent was to use the moment as a rebellion against the Time Lords and the Dalek War. Of course, the other Doctors, obviously, they come up with a resolution that obviously the Gallifreyans don't say we applaud this. He'd been working apparently all those 50 years fathoming how to save Gallifrey, but he didn't get their permission. He did something against what even authority said.
Yeah, and the War Doc's a very interesting one, because obviously you then have the knock-on effect with his decision making on the other Doctors, and I think that you take, in general, Eccleston's one Doctor is very anti-establishment in general terms because of that. But this is back at the Time Lords, I think, using the Doctor in some ways to do things that they are too scared, unwilling to do. So that very approach has created someone like the War Doctor, who's willing to take aspects that they wouldn't do, and the same thing whenever that is recovered is also against their will. So all of the Doctors do things, but for not necessarily the same things, but for reasons which means that they are different from the Time Lords, but the Time Lords do use them.
And so is anti-establishment in the way that the Doctors are against the Time Lord war strategy. They're actually against what's going on. They don't like what's going on, and they challenge the whole concept of how the Time War is being kind of executed.
Yeah, and I think that again, that's the idea. I think you get some form of person who is used by a society because they are rogue, not necessarily having sex and dancing to Kylie Minogue, but because they are different from the society, but they are still used by them to an extent. Sort of like this is the whole idea that we do with military, is that we tend to use people who, in other forms, and this is the problem whenever soldiers come back from war, is that they have been changed so much by doing what the society wants that they don't fit into the society that they fought for. I think that's true of the Doctor.
Yeah, he's like a war veteran, isn't he?
Yeah.
He's just a misfit because yeah, which I find in the end the Night of the Doctor, which was that lovely little scene added by Stephen Moffat where you saw the Paul McGann Doctor decide, I need to be a different type of person. I need the Doctor element of me anymore. I need to be a war doctor, and you got to see a bit of reasoning and motive behind why he suddenly changed personality. Overall, then, I mean, this is the parlor game we're playing here. Overall, is what works character wise. This is what my opening criticism was of RTD, that he's made him quite establishment. He's made him quite conventional. He's the fact that the Doctor's modus operandi at the moment seems to be to please. That, I think, cripples this idea of being anti-establishment, because I think he's too conflicted nowadays. So overall, when you think of the Doctor's character and how he should be, do you think he is mostly working against the system, working against, because obviously there's immorality and all the rest of it?
I think, yes, the Doctor has to be resolving issues. So for there to be an issue, he has to be anti what's going on, and that's part of that. I think there's a big problem with the last couple of series and what Russell's done, which has moved it into fantasy, which makes what is establishment and not establishment much harder to judge. So the whole idea of gods coming in and that's just a bit odd, and it makes the question of what is establishment harder to do. So whenever he tried it with Dot and Bubble, where it was actually the society that he saved was then the problem because of the racism, but then he gives them a planet.
Yeah.
And there isn't a resolution to the problem there, because the actual problem, if you're saying it's the racism, is only introduced in the last couple of minutes, so there can't be a resolution. But that's part of the problem. They have to give the Doctor a certain amount of flexibility, but you have to establish what the establishment is in each of the stories that he wants to change.
And I think one dangerous path we've gone down with present Doctor Who is the establishment that he is anti is basically conservatism, is almost where people stand on certain issues to do with gender and everything. Season 2, if I'm being fair, seemed to be really an attack on toxic masculinity. You know, I mean, it was kind of attack a certain gender, very bogged down in contemporary Earth. You know, when there's so much more else you could do. Seemed to be an attack on conspiracy theorists, as if that was up there with Davros. You know, I mean,
Yeah,
I feel as though, you know, the Doctor seems to be fighting an attitude, a political movement now, rather than really what he used to do.
yeah, and so we go back to discussions that we've had before about what happens in the 70s. The Doctor is written by a variety of people who have a variety of political views.
Yeah.
And there is that idea of tolerance of different views that have to be tolerated if you work in a society that is basically liberal. So all the people that were writing for the Doctor Who might be sort of to the right or to the left. I mean, obviously we've discussed Malcolm Hulke before, but all of them are about having the freedom for other people to have political views that you might not accept. And actually, thinking about that, that's part of the problem I have with this, is if you aren't allowing what is a fairly standard political view allowed by a liberal society, then you become the totalitarian.
I think that's a good point where we could conclude on this. RTD, are you listening? The anti-establishment Doctor. You've just heard what Hugh said then. I think that we will park it there as a thought. So thank you very much, Hugh, for your contributions today. That was another lovely chat. We'll see you all again. Thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe. The Sense Fee is going nowhere. RTD. Note that. Okay. Bye, Hugh.